Success gave me everything except a family. I built a commercial real estate empire worth 9 figures. But I damaged all 3 of my children through consistent absence and lost my marriage because being married to me was lonelier than being alone. Learning too late that children don't just need you for the big moments, but for the small daily accumulation of presence and attention that builds connection. Fear of poverty from my childhood drove me to achieve relentlessly, but ambition became an addiction. The ambition that justified every missed dinner and canceled family event with the lie that I was doing it for their future. The truth is, children don't want advantages as much as they want a present parent. Achievement without relationships feels hollow. All the money I made, all the properties I acquired, all the recognition I received. It meant nothing at 81 because I'd lost my family through consistent deprioritization across decades. And now I'm wealthy, comfortable, successful, and profoundly alone. You can't get back missed childhoods or rebuild relationships from scratch when everyone's already built their lives around your absence. Because satisfaction doesn't come from achievement, but from connection and being fully present for your life and the people in it.
I never believed that luxury could feel like loneliness until the evening of November 8, 2024. That was the night I met a woman who would fundamentally alter everything I thought I knew about success, ambition, and the price we pay for achieving what we're told will make us happy. What she told me in those quiet hours in a hotel lounge would haunt me, challenge me, and ultimately lead me here, to you, sharing a truth so uncomfortable yet so essential that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it until it's too late. My name is Branson, and it is consistently my pleasure to share with you stories from my personal experiences with remarkable individuals who have traversed this life. As always, my name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I witnessed, what I learned, and what I'm about to share with you. Because the old woman was right about one thing. Success gave her everything except a family. And understanding how that happened, how someone can climb so high while simultaneously losing everything that makes the climb worthwhile, might be the most important lesson any ambitious person can learn. This is that story. It was one of those November evenings when early winter asserts itself, the air sharp enough to require a coat, the darkness arriving before dinner, the sense of the year winding down whether we're ready or not. I was staying at the Whitmore Grand Hotel in downtown Boston, killing time before a late flight home after a journalism conference that had been mostly forgettable. The hotel lounge was one of those carefully designed spaces that radiate understated luxury, soft leather seating, warm lighting from brass fixtures, the quiet murmur of well-dressed people conducting business or unwinding after long days. I'm a freelance writer, which means I spend a lot of time in hotels and airports and other transient spaces, watching people and wondering about their stories. I've learned that the most interesting narratives often belong to people who look like they have everything figured out but carry something heavy beneath the polished surface. The wealthy businessman checked his phone compulsively. The perfectly groomed woman drinking alone. The elderly gentleman staring at nothing while the world moves around him. That evening, the lounge was moderately populated with the usual mix of hotel guests and local professionals using the space for cocktail meetings. Small groups clustered around cocktail tables, their conversation creating a gentle background buzz. A pianist played soft jazz on a grand piano in the corner, his music weaving through the conversations without dominating them. And then there was her. She sat alone at a corner table with a view of the city lights through floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of red wine untouched in front of her, her attention seemingly focused on the view but her eyes holding that distant quality that suggested she was seeing something beyond the present moment. She appeared to be in her early 80s, though she carried her age with such refined dignity that precise estimation was difficult. What struck me immediately was the contrast she embodied. Everything about her appearance spoke of wealth and careful maintenance. The elegant silver suit that was clearly bespoke, the pearl necklace that looked like it had its own insurance policy, the subtle but expensive watch on her wrist, the perfectly coiffed white hair, the manicured hands. She radiated the kind of polished sophistication that money can buy and decades of moving in affluent circles can cultivate. But despite being in the middle of a lively social space, despite being impeccably dressed and clearly belonging in this expensive environment, she sat utterly alone. No companion across from her, no phone in her hand connecting her to distant others, no book or magazine to occupy her attention. Just elegant, expensive solitude in the midst of social activity. I found myself watching her, trying to understand the story her posture told. She sat with perfect bearing, back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands folded gracefully in her lap when not reaching for the wine glass. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, in the slight downward tilt of her chin, that spoke of weight being carried. Not physical weight, but the accumulated heaviness of years of choices and their consequences. I'd claimed a chair near the piano with my laptop open, ostensibly working on an article but actually people watching, as I often do. My attention kept returning to the elderly woman, drawn by the paradox she represented, surrounded by luxury yet radiating loneliness, clearly wealthy yet somehow diminished, present in the space but emotionally elsewhere. After perhaps 30 minutes of this observation, a small incident created an opportunity for connection. The waiter, carrying a tray of drinks to a nearby table, stumbled slightly and caught himself, but the motion caused one of the glasses to slide. It didn't fall, but the near accident drew gasps and attention from multiple tables. The elderly woman, startled from her reverie, looked up and met my eyes across the room. We both had witnessed the same moment, and something in our simultaneous reaction created a connection. I smiled, "That was close," expression, and she smiled back, not the polite, practiced smile of social obligation, but something more genuine and knowing. Then, surprising both of us I think, she gestured slightly to the empty seat across from her, a subtle invitation. I found myself standing and walking over before I'd consciously decided to move, drawn by some instinct that told me this woman was carrying a story worth hearing. "That was nearly very expensive," she said as I approached, her voice cultured and clear despite her age, carrying the faint traces of what might have been a southern accent smoothed by decades elsewhere. Though I suspect this establishment would have absorbed the cost without involving the poor waiter. "The advantage of being an expensive hotel," I agreed, gesturing to the seat she'd indicated. "May I?" "Please," she said warmly. "I've been sitting alone for almost an hour, and I'm discovering that solitude, while sometimes necessary, can become oppressive when you're surrounded by people enjoying company." I sat down, and a waiter materialized instantly to take my drink order. After he departed, I introduced myself. "I'm David. I'm in town for a conference, killing time before a late flight." "Lenora," she replied, extending her hand across the table. Her grip was firm despite her age, her hand cool and dry. "Lenora Ashford Whitmore. And yes, before you ask, my family did build this hotel, though I had nothing to do with it. That was 3 generations ago. I'm just one of many descendants who benefit from ancestors' ambition." The casual way she mentioned owning a share of a luxury hotel told me immediately that wealth wasn't just comfortable for her. It was so normalized as to be unremarkable. People who need to impress you with their money trumpet it. People for whom wealth is simply the backdrop of existence mention it the way others might mention their hometown. "That's quite a legacy to inherit," I said. "Yes," Lenora agreed, but there was something in her tone, not quite bitterness, but a complicated relationship with that legacy. Though I should clarify, I didn't just inherit wealth. I built my own fortune, quite separate from the family hotels. I spent 45 years building a commercial real estate empire across the Northeast. Started with one small property in Hartford in 1966 and ended with a portfolio worth 9 figures when I finally sold the company in 2011. She said this matter-of-factly, without boasting, simply stating biographical facts. But I noticed she didn't smile when discussing her success, didn't show the pride one might expect from someone describing such significant achievement. "That's remarkable," I said, genuinely impressed. "Especially starting in the 1960s when it must have been even harder for women in commercial real estate." "It was," Lenora confirmed. "Though being a Whitmore opened doors that were closed to other women. I had access to capital and connections that most people could only dream of. But I still had to prove myself at every turn, still had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. The name gave me opportunity, but I built the success through my own work." She took a sip of her wine, the first time she'd touched it since I'd sat down, and looked at me with eyes that were remarkably sharp and clear for someone in her 9th decade. You're a writer, aren't you? You have that look, the way you've been watching people all evening, cataloging details, constructing narratives. What do you write about? How did you, I started, then laughed. I suppose I'm not as subtle as I think I am. Yes, I'm a journalist. I write features for various magazines, and I collect human stories in my spare time. I'm fascinated by what people reveal about themselves in unguarded moments. And what did you observe about me? Lenora asked, genuine curiosity in her voice but also something else, a kind of recognition as if she'd already guessed what I'd seen. I considered being polite and deflecting, but something about Lenora suggested she'd appreciate honesty more than flattery. I observed someone who has achieved everything our culture tells us to aspire to: wealth, success, independence, comfort. But who's sitting alone in a hotel lounge on a Friday evening, untouched wine in front of her, surrounded by people enjoying company, looking profoundly lonely. I expected her to be offended or defensive. Instead, Lenora's expression shifted into something that looked like relief, as if I'd named something she'd been carrying but hadn't spoken aloud. That, she said quietly, is the most accurate observation anyone has made about me in years. Most people see the exterior, the expensive clothes, the family name, the portfolio value, and assume that's the complete story. You're the first person in a long time to look past the surface and see what's actually there. She set down her wine glass with careful precision and looked at me directly. David, would you like to hear a story? A cautionary tale about success and what it actually costs? I warn you, it's not the inspiring bootstrap narrative people usually prefer. It's about how someone can build an empire and lose a family. How you can acquire everything on the success checklist and discover you've missed what actually matters. I had nowhere else to be, and every instinct told me I was about to hear something important. I would be honored to listen. Lenora settled back in her chair, her posture relaxing slightly, as if unburdening herself of weight she'd been carrying. Then let me tell you about Lenora Ashford. Before she became Lenora Ashford Whitmore, before she became a millionaire, before she became the woman sitting alone in a hotel lounge at 81, very rich and very much without a family. I need to start by telling you about where I came from, Lenora began, her voice taking on the quality of someone reaching back across decades to retrieve memories carefully stored. Because understanding my beginnings explains, though doesn't excuse, the choices I made later. Context doesn't justify consequences, but it illuminates them. She shifted in her chair, getting comfortable for what would clearly be a long narrative. I was born in 1943 in a small town in rural Georgia, not the Atlanta or Savannah that tourists visit, but the deep Georgia of red clay and cotton fields and economic realities that were brutal for most people. My father was a tenant farmer, my mother took in sewing when she could get it. We weren't just poor, we were what folks today might call working poor, though back then we were just trying to survive. Lenora's expression grew distant as she traveled back to that world. I was the middle child of 5 children, 2 older brothers, a younger brother, and a younger sister. We lived in a 4-room house that belonged to the landowner, heated by a wood stove, no indoor plumbing until I was 12. My mother cooked on that same wood stove year-round. Summers were unbearable. But more than the physical discomfort, Lenora continued, what I remember most vividly is the constant anxiety about money. Every expense was a calculation, a negotiation. New shoes when your feet grew meant someone else didn't get something they needed. A visit to the doctor meant eating more sparsely for weeks. I watched my mother's face tighten every time unexpected costs arose, saw my father's shoulders sag under the weight of never quite earning enough to feel secure. She took another small sip of wine, holding the glass as if it anchored her to the present while she explored the past. I was about 8 years old when I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. We just learned that my younger sister needed glasses, she couldn't see the blackboard at school, was struggling academically because of vision problems she'd never mentioned because she didn't want to burden the family with another expense. Lenora's voice grew quieter. I remember my parents having a conversation late at night, thinking the children were all asleep. My mother was crying quietly, and my father was trying to figure out where they could find the money for glasses. They eventually decided my mother would take on extra sewing work, my father would try to find weekend labor. But the stress in their voices, the weight of such a simple need, glasses for a child, creating such profound anxiety, it marked something in me permanently. That night, Lenora said, I made a vow to myself. I would never, ever live in poverty. I would never experience that helpless anxiety of not being able to afford necessities. I would never be in a position where my children's basic needs felt like insurmountable expenses. I would do whatever it took to achieve financial security. She looked at me directly. That vow, that fear-driven determination, it was both my greatest source of strength and my most profound source of destruction. Because fear is a powerful motivator, but it's also an unforgiving master. And I was about to spend 60 years serving that master, sacrificing everything else on the altar of financial security. Lenora continued, I was a good student, not naturally brilliant, but disciplined and focused. I understood early that education was the only path out of the poverty I'd been born into. I worked hard, won a scholarship to a small college in North Carolina, and studied business administration at a time when most women were expected to pursue teaching or nursing if they went to college at all. And I met Thomas Whitmore, she said, and for the first time, her voice softened with something that might have been affection or might have been regret. Thomas was from money, old hotel money, though not as much as his family wanted people to believe. The Whitmore Grand Hotels were prestigious but not hugely profitable. Thomas was charming, educated, ambitious in his own way, and he was absolutely fascinated by me. Lenora smiled slightly at the memory. I was different from the women he'd grown up around. I wasn't polished or connected or trained in the social graces that his social circle valued. But I was hungry in a way he found compelling. I had drive and determination and a vision for building something significant. He told me later that my ambition was what first attracted him, the sense that I was going somewhere and wouldn't let anything stop me. We married in 1964, right after I graduated, Lenora said. I was 21, he was 24. And I'll be honest with you, I loved Thomas, genuinely loved him, but I also understood that marrying into the Whitmore family gave me access to capital, connections, and credibility I couldn't have achieved on my own. It wasn't coldly calculated, but it wasn't purely romantic either. I was practical about my advantages, even then. She paused. We had our first child in 1965, Margot. Then Calvin in 1967, and Sinclair in 1969. 3 children in 4 years, which was exhausting but expected. And for a few years, I tried to be the wife and mother that both Thomas and society expected me to be. I organized the household, attended the right social functions, raised the children with help from nannies and housekeepers that Thomas's money afforded us. But I was restless, Lenora admitted. Deeply, profoundly restless. I'd watch Thomas go off to manage the family hotel business, watch other men build companies and make deals and create wealth, and I felt like I was slowly suffocating. I'd been trained for business, had ambitions beyond domestic management, but there was no obvious path for a young mother in 1968 to pursue those ambitions without being seen as neglectful or unwomanly. Lenora's expression became more animated, her eyes brightening with the memory of what came next. Then, in 1966, an opportunity presented itself. A small commercial property in Hartford was going up for auction, a 3-story office building in decent condition but poorly managed. Thomas's uncle mentioned it casually at a family dinner, noting that he'd considered buying it as an investment but decided it wasn't worth the effort. And I became obsessed with that property, Lenora said. I drove to Hartford to see it, researched the area's economic development, ran the numbers dozens of times. I saw something everyone else had missed, that Hartford was positioning itself as an insurance and financial services hub, and commercial office space in the right locations would become increasingly valuable. That building was in exactly the right location. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more intense. I convinced Thomas to loan me the capital for the down payment, promising to repay him from rental income. I bought that building in January 1966, and within 6 months I'd renovated it, signed long-term leases with 2 insurance companies, and was generating enough income to cover the mortgage and start building equity. It was my first real success, and the feeling was intoxicating. Lenora's expression showed the complexity of that memory, pride and pleasure mixed with something darker. That success changed everything. Not all at once, but gradually. I'd found something I was genuinely good at: identifying undervalued properties, seeing economic development patterns before others did, negotiating favorable terms, managing renovations efficiently. I had a gift for commercial real estate, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly capable and valuable beyond my role as wife and mother. Within 5 years, I'd acquired 3 more properties in different Connecticut cities, Lenora continued. I'd formed my own company, Ashford Properties, using my maiden name rather than Whitmore to establish my own identity separate from Thomas's family. The business was thriving, growing faster than I'd imagined possible. And I was working constantly. Her voice grew quieter. That's when the balancing act began to tip, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I'd wake up early to handle business calls before the children woke up. I'd work during their nap times. I'd make phone calls from the house while they played. I'd schedule property visits during their school hours. I convinced myself I was managing both roles successfully, being present for the important moments while building my business during the cracks. Lenora looked at me directly. But here's what I didn't understand then and only recognize now: children don't just need you for the big moments. They need you for the small ones, the daily accumulation of presence and attention that builds connection and security. And I was increasingly absent during those small moments, physically there sometimes but mentally elsewhere, always thinking about the next property, the next negotiation, the next opportunity. She paused, her hands tightening slightly around her wineglass. Thomas noticed. He'd make gentle comments about how distracted I seemed, how much time I was spending on the business, how the children were missing me. But his comments felt like criticism rather than concern. I interpreted his worry as him wanting to keep me small, wanting me to give up my success to conform to traditional roles. I told myself he was threatened by my achievement, that he couldn't handle having a wife who was more successful than his family's stable but unexciting hotel business. Looking back, Lenora said with evident regret, Thomas wasn't threatened. He was worried about me, about our children, about our marriage. He could see the obsession growing, could see me sacrificing connection for achievement. But I couldn't hear him because ambition had become louder than love. Lenora settled back in her chair, and I could see the weight of memory pressing down on her. The 1970s were my decade of explosive growth, professionally. I expanded beyond Connecticut into Massachusetts and Rhode Island. I developed expertise in transforming struggling properties into premium assets. I built a reputation for being shrewd but fair, demanding but reliable. By 1980, Ashford Properties owned or managed 47 commercial buildings across 5 states. I was legitimately wealthy, not Whitmore family wealthy yet, but substantial. And my family, Lenora said quietly, was falling apart so gradually I barely noticed until the damage was irreversible. Lenora took a longer pause, and I could see her gathering herself to share what was clearly more difficult territory. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, less pride in accomplishment, more recognition of cost. The thing about ambition, Lenora said thoughtfully, is that it justifies itself at every turn. Every missed dinner, every canceled family vacation, every time you choose work over presence, you can always construct a justification that sounds reasonable. I'm doing this for their future. I'm building security for the family. This opportunity won't wait. This deal is too important to delegate. They'll understand when they're older. She looked at me intently. And those justifications, they're not entirely wrong. I was building security for my family. My success did provide advantages they wouldn't have had otherwise: excellent schools, comfortable homes, opportunities for travel and enrichment. But what I failed to understand until far too late is that children don't want advantages as much as they want a present parent. They need you there, actually there, not physically present but mentally absent, not checking boxes but genuinely engaged. Lenora's expression grew pained. Margot was my first loss, though I didn't recognize it as loss at the time. She was the sensitive one, the artistic one, the child who needed emotional connection and reassurance. And I was not equipped to provide that, especially as my business consumed more and more of my attention and emotional energy. I remember Margot was maybe 12 years old, Lenora said, her voice distant with memory. She'd been selected for the lead in her school play, Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. She was so excited, came home with the script clutched in her hands, practically vibrating with joy. She asked if I'd help her practice her lines, and I said yes, of course, I'd love to help. Lenora's hands tightened around her wine glass. But then a major deal hit complications. A property I'd been negotiating to acquire for 8 months suddenly had title issues that required immediate attention. I spent the next 2 weeks almost entirely focused on solving those problems. And Margot stopped asking me to help with her lines. She'd practice with the nanny instead, or alone in her room. Opening night of the play, I had a closing scheduled in Boston that I couldn't reschedule, Lenora said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas offered to go to the play with the boys, said they'd save me a seat in case I could make it late. But the closing ran long, and by the time I arrived at the school, the play was over. I found Thomas and the boys in the hallway outside the auditorium. And Margot was still in costume, her Dorothy dress and ruby slippers, and she looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. Not anger, not even disappointment really. Just resignation. Like she'd already learned not to expect me to show up. Lenora's eyes were wet now, though no tears fell. I apologized, explained about the closing, promised I'd make it up to her. She said, "It's okay, Mom. I know you're busy." And she meant it. She wasn't being passive-aggressive. She genuinely understood and accepted that her mother's work was more important than her school play. And somehow that acceptance, that premature maturity, was worse than anger would have been. That was the pattern that developed through the rest of Margot's childhood and adolescence, Lenora continued. I'd miss events, miss moments, miss conversations. And she'd grow increasingly distant, increasingly self-sufficient, increasingly convinced that she couldn't rely on me for emotional support. By the time she went to college, we were polite strangers who happened to be related. Lenora took a shaky breath. Calvin, my middle child, reacted differently. Where Margot withdrew, Calvin acted out. Started getting in trouble at school. Nothing major at first, just enough to get attention. Fights with other students, skipping classes, barely passing when his intelligence suggested he should excel. Thomas would get calls from the school, would have to leave work to handle disciplinary meetings. And I, Lenora admitted with evident shame, I was frustrated by Calvin's behavior. I couldn't understand why he was making such obviously self-destructive choices. I'd have stern conversations with him about throwing away his opportunities, about how hard I was working to provide for his future. And he'd look at me with this mixture of anger and desperation and say, "I don't want your future. I want you now." She shook her head slowly. But I couldn't hear him. I interpreted his behavior as defiance rather than desperation. I thought he was being dramatic, manipulative, attention-seeking. It never occurred to me that he was literally crying out for attention because that was exactly what he needed and wasn't getting. So I responded by working harder, achieving more, as if additional success would somehow solve the problems my success was creating. Sinclair, my youngest, handled it best of the three, Lenora said. He was easygoing, adaptable, seemed to roll with my absences without visible damage. He'd say, "Don't worry about it, Mom," when I missed his soccer games or science fairs. He'd joke about having the famous mom, who was always traveling for business. He seemed fine. Her expression grew darker. But Sinclair wasn't fine. He just learned early to hide his needs, to not ask for things he'd learned he wouldn't receive. He became independent by necessity, self-sufficient out of adaptation rather than natural temperament. And while that independence served him well professionally as an adult, it also meant he never learned to form deep emotional attachments, never learned to be vulnerable or ask for help. My absence taught him that relying on people leads to disappointment, so it's safer to rely only on yourself. Lenora looked at me with eyes full of recognition that came too late. I damaged all three of my children, each in different ways. Margot learned not to expect emotional support. Calvin learned that the only way to get attention was through crisis. Sinclair learned not to need anyone. And all of that damage, every bit of it, came from my choice to prioritize achievement over presence, success over connection, building an empire over building a family. But even as I watched my relationships with my children deteriorate, Lenora said, her voice growing stronger with a kind of anguished intensity, I couldn't stop. Because by the late 1970s, work wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. My identity was entirely bound up in being Lenora Ashford, successful real estate developer. Take away that role, and I didn't know who I was. Mother, wife, those felt like secondary identities, less authentic, less valued by the world and therefore less valued by me. She paused, then continued more quietly. And Thomas grew increasingly tired. Not just physically tired, though managing 3 children essentially alone while working his own demanding job was exhausting. But tired of being alone in a marriage, tired of trying to reach a wife who was increasingly unreachable, tired of being the only parent who showed up. We still lived in the same house, still maintained the appearance of a functioning marriage, but the emotional connection, whatever genuine intimacy we'd once had, was gone. He asked me once, in 1982, if I could imagine scaling back the business, Lenora said. Not abandoning it, just reducing my hours, delegating more, being more present for the few remaining years before all the children left home. And She paused, shaking her head. I reacted with anger. How dare he ask me to limit my success? Didn't he understand how hard I'd worked to build what I'd built? Didn't he see that my business wasn't just a hobby but a legitimate achievement worthy of my full effort? Her voice grew bitter. I framed his request as him trying to diminish me, trying to keep me in a traditional female role, threatened by my success. But that wasn't what he was asking. He was begging, literally begging, for me to save our family before it was too late. And I was so defensive, so convinced that any limitation on my ambition was an attack on my identity, that I couldn't hear what he was actually saying. Thomas filed for divorce in 1985, Lenora said flatly. I was 42. We'd been married 21 years. Margot was in college, Calvin was 18 and barely graduated from high school, Sinclair was 16. And my very first reaction when Thomas told me he wanted a divorce, was relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to pretend anymore, wouldn't have to feel guilty about missing dinners, wouldn't have the constant low-level conflict about my work hours and priorities. She looked at me with eyes that had clearly examined this moment countless times. That relief lasted about 48 hours. Then the reality hit. I was losing my family. Not because of some external tragedy, not because of circumstances beyond my control, but because I'd systematically chosen work over them for 20 years. Thomas wasn't leaving because he'd fallen in love with someone else, or because we fought constantly, or because of any dramatic betrayal. He was leaving because being married to me was lonelier than being alone. Lenora's voice grew quieter. The divorce was civilized. We had excellent lawyers, significant assets to divide, children to consider. Thomas got primary custody because that's what the children wanted, because they'd been living primarily with him for years anyway. I got visitation rights that I only occasionally used because I was still traveling constantly for business. We divided property, negotiated settlements, signed papers. Everything was handled maturely, rationally, with minimal acrimony. And I threw myself even deeper into work, Lenora said, because work was where I felt competent and successful and valuable. Work was where I had control. Work was where I didn't have to confront what I'd lost or my role in losing it. Between 1985 and 2000, Ashford Properties more than doubled in size and value. I became one of the most successful female commercial real estate developers in the Northeast. I was featured in business magazines, invited to speak at conferences, held up as an example of female achievement in a male-dominated field. Her expression became almost haunted. And my children grew up in a way, building their own lives with minimal connection to me. Margot moved to California after college, became a teacher, married someone I met exactly once, at the wedding. Calvin struggled for years, went through addiction and recovery, eventually found stability as a social worker. Sinclair became a successful attorney, married and divorced twice, maintained cordial but distant contact. I had grandchildren, Lenora said, her voice cracking slightly. 7 grandchildren total from my 3 children. And I barely know them. I send generous checks for birthdays and holidays. I'm invited to major events out of obligation. But I'm not grandma in any meaningful sense. I'm the wealthy woman who's technically related to them, who makes appearances but isn't part of their actual lives. And that distance, that's my legacy. That's what I built while I was so focused on building my empire. The lounge had grown quieter around us as Lenora spoke, other patrons gradually departing for dinner or their rooms. The pianist had stopped playing, his shift apparently ended. But I was completely absorbed in Lenora's story, watching this elegant elderly woman dismantle the narrative of success and reveal the devastation beneath. So yes, Lenora said, looking around the expensive hotel lounge with a gesture that encompassed not just the space but her entire life, I'm very rich. I sold Ashford Properties in 2011 for an amount of money I still have trouble conceptualizing. I own property in multiple states. I have investments that generate income one couldn't spend in 3 lifetimes. I can afford anything money can buy. She looked at me directly. But I can't buy back the childhood moments I missed. Can't buy back my marriage. Can't buy genuine relationships with my adult children or grandchildren. Can't buy the family dinners and holiday gatherings and ordinary daily connections that make life meaningful. Because those things aren't for sale. They're earned through consistent presence and attention and prioritization across years and decades. And I didn't do that work. I was too busy doing other work. We sat in heavy silence for several minutes after Lenora finished speaking. I found myself thinking about my own life, my own ambitions and priorities, the ways I might already be making choices I'd regret decades hence. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Please. You mentioned that you reacted with anger when Thomas asked you to scale back your business. Looking back now, can you identify what was driving that reaction? Why scaling back felt impossible, even threatening? Lenora considered this carefully. That's an excellent question, and one I've spent considerable time in therapy trying to answer. I think there were several interrelated factors. First, and most obvious, was my childhood poverty. That fear I mentioned, the fear of scarcity, of not having enough, it never left me. Even when I was objectively wealthy, even when I had more money than I could spend, some part of me was always that 8-year-old girl listening to her parents agonize over paying for her sister's glasses. She continued, but it was more than just fear of scarcity. It was also about identity and value. I'd been raised in a world where women's value came from supporting men and raising children. But I'd proven I could be valuable in a different way, through business acumen, through building wealth, through competing successfully in a male-dominated field. And that alternative source of value felt precious, hard-won, fragile. Scaling back felt like voluntarily diminishing myself, returning to traditional roles I'd worked so hard to escape. Lenora's voice became more thoughtful. And there was something else, something I'm almost ashamed to admit. I was addicted to achievement. Not to money itself, money was just how success was measured, but to the feeling of winning, of closing a difficult deal, of outmaneuvering competitors, of being recognized as successful. That constant pursuit of the next achievement, the next validation, it provided a chemical rush that family life couldn't match. Family life is slow and repetitive, Lenora explained. It's the same routines, the same small moments, the gradual accumulation of connection through consistent presence. There's no dramatic victory, no moment of triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of being there. And for someone whose brain had been wired to pursue achievement, that wasn't stimulating enough. I needed the high of success, and I was willing to sacrifice everything else to keep chasing it. She looked at me directly. That's what ambition can become if you're not careful, an addiction. And like any addiction, it demands everything and gives back less and less satisfaction over time. I achieved more and more while feeling less and less fulfilled. But I couldn't stop, because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness, and I wasn't ready to do that. When did you become ready? I asked. Lenora's expression grew distant. 2014. I was 71 years old. It was Thanksgiving, and none of my children invited me to spend it with them. Not out of cruelty, but because we'd established such distance that it didn't occur to them to include me. They each had their own families, their own traditions, and I wasn't part of those. Her voice became quieter. I spent Thanksgiving alone in my apartment. A beautiful apartment, expensive furnishings, incredible views. I had everything money could buy. And I sat at my dining table, just me and a meal delivered from an upscale restaurant, and I thought, this is what success looks like. This is what I sacrificed everything to achieve. Expensive solitude. That's when something broke open, Lenora said. Or maybe broke through. I realized I'd spent 71 years building wealth and losing people. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to achieve when I made that childhood vow to never live in poverty. I'd proven I could succeed in business, could be independent, could build an empire. I'd won every external measure of success. And I was profoundly, devastatingly unhappy, she continued. Not dramatically unhappy, I wasn't suicidal or despairing. Just empty. Successful and empty. Rich and lonely. Accomplished and disconnected. And I finally understood what Thomas had been trying to tell me 30 years earlier. Achievement without relationships feels hollow. I watched emotions play across Lenora's face. Regret, recognition, a kind of hard-won wisdom. What did you do? I tried to rebuild connections, Lenora said. Reached out to my children, asked if we could spend more time together, tried to show interest in their lives and my grandchildren. And they were polite. Cordial. But we'd missed the window for building genuine closeness. You can't show up when your children are in their 40s and expect to suddenly have the relationship you would have had if you'd been present when they were growing up. The foundation wasn't there. Her voice carried acceptance rather than self-pity. Margot told me once, gently, that she appreciated my efforts but couldn't give me the mother-daughter relationship I seemed to want because we'd never built that foundation. She said, "Mom, I love you because you're my mother, but I don't know you. And you don't really know me. We're cordial relatives, and maybe that's what we'll always be." That was hard to hear, Lenora admitted, but it was also honest and probably more compassion than I deserved. Because she was right. I don't know my adult children in any meaningful way. I don't know their favorite foods or their fears or their dreams or the small daily details that make up their actual lives. I know their biographical facts, where they live, what they do for work, their children's names. But I don't know them. Calvin was angrier, Lenora continued. When I tried to rebuild our relationship, he told me he'd spent his 20s in therapy working through his childhood wounds, learning to function despite feeling fundamentally unimportant to his own mother. He said he'd done the work to heal and move on, and my sudden interest in connection felt manipulative, like I wanted him to give me absolution or make me feel better about my choices. He said, "You can't skip the decades of work and arrive at the closeness. That's not how it works." And Sinclair, Lenora said, he was the kindest but also the most distant. He maintains regular, polite contact. We have lunch quarterly, talk on the phone monthly. But it's surface-level connection, carefully managed emotional distance. He learned from my example to be independent, to not need people deeply. So even when I try to build something more meaningful, he doesn't really know how to engage with that. Lenora took a slow breath. So I accepted that I'd lost the possibility of close family relationships. That ship had sailed, and the choices I'd made years earlier had determined the course. I couldn't repair what I'd broken, couldn't rebuild what I'd never built in the first place. But I could, Lenora said, her voice growing stronger, try to help other people not make the same mistakes. That's why I'm telling you this story. That's why I talk about it when people ask how I became successful. Because the usual narrative about my career, ambitious woman overcomes obstacles to build empire, that narrative is incomplete. The full story includes what that ambition cost. She leaned forward. I want young people who are building their careers to understand that success and family aren't incompatible, but they require intentional balancing. You can't just assume family will take care of itself while you focus on work. You have to actively prioritize connection, show up consistently, make choices that sometimes feel like they're limiting your achievement but are actually building what really matters. I want parents to understand, Lenora continued with intensity, that children need your presence more than your achievements. They need you there, actually there, engaged and attentive, for the small moments that build connection. Missing occasional events because of genuine necessity is one thing. Missing events as a pattern because work is always more urgent, that teaches children they're not important enough to prioritize. And I want ambitious people to understand that achievement is never enough, she said firmly. Never. You'll always want the next thing, the next level, the next validation. Achievement is an endless treadmill, and if you're not careful, you'll sacrifice everything else chasing something that can never actually satisfy you. Because satisfaction doesn't come from achievement. It comes from connection, from being fully present for your life and the people in it. Lenora settled back, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. That's what I wish someone had told me when I was 25 and starting my business. Not that I shouldn't pursue success, but that success without relationships is just expensive loneliness. That all the money I'd make, all the properties I'd acquire, all the recognition I'd receive, none of it would matter at 81 if I'd lost my family in the process. And I did lose my family, she said quietly. Not through death or dramatic estrangement, but through consistent deprioritization across decades. Death by 1,000 choices. And now I live with that consequence. Wealthy, comfortable, successful, and profoundly alone. I sat processing everything Lenora had shared, feeling the weight of her story settling over me. Around us, the lounge was now nearly empty, just a few scattered patrons and the quiet efficiency of staff preparing to close for the night. "Can I ask what you do now?" I said finally. "How you spend your days?" Lenora smiled, but it was a complicated expression. "I volunteer. Quite a lot, actually. I fund and personally work with organizations that support working parents, that provide childcare and flexible work arrangements, that help people balance career and family more successfully than I did. I'm on the board of several nonprofits focused on family support services." She continued, "And I donate substantially to family-focused causes. Shelters for families experiencing homelessness. Scholarships specifically for parents returning to education. Programs that help incarcerated parents maintain connections with their children. I'm trying in whatever way I can to help other families stay connected when economic pressures threaten to tear them apart." "That's admirable," I said, and I meant it. "It's inadequate," Lenora replied honestly. "Philanthropy is meaningful work, and I'm glad to do it. But it doesn't fix what I broke in my own family. It doesn't give me back the decades I missed. It's just the best use I can make of the wealth I accumulated at such high cost." She paused, then added, "And I think there's something almost ironic about it. I spend my money trying to help other families avoid the mistakes I made. I fund programs that help parents be more present for their children. I support services that reduce the economic pressure that forced my parents to sacrifice so much. I'm using the wealth I acquired by sacrificing my family to help other people not sacrifice theirs." "That irony isn't lost on me," Lenora said. "But I suppose it's also fitting. The money has to mean something. It can't just sit in accounts or get passed to children who don't need it and barely know me. If it can help even a few families maintain connections that might otherwise be lost to economic stress or misplaced priorities, then maybe it serves some purpose beyond just being a number on a balance sheet." I found myself thinking about the photograph I'd imagined earlier, Lenora alone in her expensive apartment on Thanksgiving, surrounded by luxury and disconnected from family. And now, learning she devoted herself to helping other families stay connected, the image became even more poignant. "Do your children know about your philanthropic work?" I asked. "Yes," Lenora said. "I don't hide it. But I also don't think it changes how they see me or what happened between us. Calvin once said it was nice that I was helping other families, but pointed out that it would have been nicer if I'd prioritized my own family when it mattered. And he's right. My philanthropy doesn't erase my parenting failures. It's just what I do now with the resources I have." She took a final sip of her wine, now quite depleted. "I suppose that's the complete story, or as complete as I can make it. Woman builds empire, loses family, spends remaining years wealthy and alone, trying to help others not repeat her mistakes. Not the inspiring success story people usually prefer, but it's honest. Lenora looked at me directly. And that honesty, that willingness to admit what success actually cost, that's what I think is missing from most narratives about achievement. We celebrate the victories without acknowledging the casualties. We hold up successful people as role models without examining what they sacrificed to get there. We tell young people to pursue their dreams without also teaching them to protect their relationships. I want to be honest about both parts, Lenora said firmly. Yes, I built a successful business. Yes, I proved that women can excel in male-dominated fields. Yes, I created wealth and independence and proved my childhood fear of poverty didn't have to define me. All of that is true and worth acknowledging. But it's also true, she continued, that I damaged my children through consistent absence. That I lost a marriage that could have been meaningful if I'd been willing to prioritize it. That I missed decades of family connection I can never get back. That I'm wealthy and lonely and full of regret about choices I can't undo. That's equally true and equally worth acknowledging. Lenora's voice took on a quality of urgent intensity. And if telling my complete story helps even one ambitious young person make different choices, helps them understand that presence matters more than achievement, that connection is more valuable than recognition, that family requires the same dedicated attention and strategic planning they'd give to building a business, then this uncomfortable honesty serves a purpose. Because, Lenora said, her voice growing quieter but no less intense, you can't get back missed childhoods. You can't rebuild relationships from scratch when everyone's already built their lives around your absence. You can't arrive at 81 with wealth and comfort and success and decide you'd like a family now, please. It doesn't work that way. The choices you make in your 20s, 30s, 40s about how you balance ambition and connection, those choices determine what your 80s will look like. She looked around the elegant hotel lounge, her expression making it clear she was using the space as a metaphor for her life. And my 80s look like this: beautiful, comfortable, expensive, and profoundly empty of the people who should matter most. That's the price of unchecked ambition. That's what success without balance actually looks like. Lenora stood slowly, gathering her elegant coat and handbag. I should let you get to your flight, and I've kept you far longer than I intended with my cautionary tale. I'm grateful you shared it, I said, standing as well. This has been one of the most meaningful conversations I've ever had with someone I just met. Then perhaps it wasn't chance, Lenora said with a slight smile. Perhaps you were meant to hear this story and share it with others who need the warning I wish I'd received. I'd like to think my mistakes might serve some purpose beyond just being my personal regret. We shook hands, her grip still firm despite her age. Thank you for listening without judgment, David. Most people either want to absolve me, you couldn't have known, you did your best, or condemn me. You just listened and let the story be complicated. That's a gift. As Lenora turned to leave, she paused and looked back. One more thing. If you do write about this conversation, don't sanitize it. Don't make it inspirational or redemptive in ways it isn't. I'm not some reformed villain who learned important lessons and fixed everything. I'm just an old woman who made choices that seemed right at the time but were actually slowly destroying what mattered most. And I live with those consequences. That's the honest story, uncomfortable as it is. With that, Lenora Ashford Whitmore walked slowly out of the hotel lounge, her posture still straight despite her 81 years, her expensive clothes and jewelry marking her as successful, her solitary departure marking her as alone. I watched her go, my mind full of everything she'd shared, already beginning to understand that this conversation would stay with me far longer than most. I did catch my flight that evening, though I barely remember the journey home. My mind was entirely occupied with Lenora's story, turning over her insights and warnings, examining my own life through the lens of her experience. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching Lenora Ashford Whitmore, wanting to verify her story and understand more about her life. What I discovered was fascinating and confirmed everything she'd told me, but also revealed details she hadn't mentioned. Lenora was indeed a highly successful commercial real estate developer, exactly as she'd described. Articles from the 1980s and 1990s featured her as a pioneer for women in commercial real estate, praising her business acumen and independent success. She'd been featured in Fortune, profiled in Business Week, held up as an example of female achievement in a male-dominated field. But I also found something else, something Lenora had never mentioned during our conversation. The extensive philanthropic work she described wasn't just volunteering and board positions. Lenora had established and funded multiple organizations focused specifically on helping working parents balance career and family responsibilities. The Ashford Family Foundation, which she'd created in 2015, provided grants to businesses implementing family-friendly policies, funded research on work-life balance, and supported programs helping low-income parents access quality childcare. She donated tens of millions of dollars to causes related to family support, parental leave, and early childhood development. I found an interview she'd given to a non-profit publication in 2018, where she'd been asked about her motivation for this particular philanthropic focus. Her response was brief but telling. "I learned too late that career success means nothing if you've lost your family in the process. I'm trying to help other people learn that lesson earlier and less painfully than I did." But what struck me most was something I discovered through a connection I made with someone who worked at one of the organizations Lenora supported. This person told me that Lenora didn't just donate money, she showed up. She volunteered regularly at programs supporting working parents, offering business mentoring but also listening to their struggles, their guilt, their attempts to balance competing demands. She never talks about her own family, this person told me. But you can tell there's a story there. She has this look when parents talk about missing their kids' events because of work, like she knows exactly how that feels and where it leads. And she'll gently push them to prioritize differently, to make choices she clearly wishes she'd made. I also learned that Lenora had attempted reconciliation with her children multiple times over the years, not just after that Thanksgiving in 2014 but repeatedly. She'd written letters, made phone calls, suggested family therapy, offered apologies. Her children had responded with varying degrees of receptiveness, but the fundamental distance remained. The window for building closeness had closed decades earlier, and no amount of money or late-stage effort could pry it back open. One particularly poignant detail I discovered: Lenora had established trust funds for all 7 of her grandchildren, ensuring they'd have financial security for education and beyond. But in the documentation, she'd included a letter to be given to each grandchild when they turned 18. The letters, according to someone who'd seen one, essentially said, "I'm giving you money because that's what I have to give. But I want you to know that money is a poor substitute for presence. If you remember nothing else about your grandmother, remember this: people matter more than achievement. Don't sacrifice those you love for those you want to impress." Learning about Lenora's hidden efforts to repair what she'd broken and prevent others from making her mistakes added another layer to her story. She was trying, in every way available to her, to make meaning from her mistakes. She couldn't undo the past, couldn't rebuild her own family relationships, but she could use her wealth and her cautionary tale to help others protect what she'd lost. 3 months after our conversation, I wrote a feature article about Lenora's story for a business magazine. I sent her a draft before publication, wanting her approval given how personal the content was. She responded with a short email: "David, this is accurate and fair. Publish it if you think it will help others. I don't need my name used if that makes you uncomfortable, though I'm no longer concerned about protecting my reputation. The damage is done, and if speaking honestly about it serves some purpose, then perhaps that's the best use of my story. Thank you for listening that evening." Blah. I did publish it, with her name and with her approval. The response was overwhelming, thousands of comments from people who saw themselves or their parents in Lenora's story, who recognized the pattern of prioritizing achievement over presence, who were grateful for the honest reckoning with success's costs. But the response that mattered most came from Lenora herself, about 6 weeks after publication. She sent a longer email this time. "David, your article has resulted in dozens of people reaching out to me, mostly younger professionals who say reading about my experience has caused them to reconsider their own priorities. Several have told me they've made concrete changes, turning down promotions that would require extensive travel while their children are young, setting firmer boundaries between work and family time, having honest conversations with spouses about long-term priorities. I can't know if these changes will be sustained, if these people will actually follow through on their intentions. Intentions are easy, consistent action across decades is hard. But even the possibility that my mistakes might help others make better choices, that gives me something I haven't had in a long time. A sense that my life, despite its failures, might serve some purpose beyond just accumulation and regret. So thank you for that. For listening, for writing honestly, and for helping me turn my failures into something potentially useful for others. It doesn't erase what I lost, but it makes the losing mean something beyond just my personal tragedy. I hope you're making time for whatever matters most in your life. I hope you're not sacrificing connection for achievement, presence for recognition. I hope you're learning from my story rather than someday telling your own version of it. Lenora. I read that email several times, moved by Lenora's continued commitment to honesty even in private communication, grateful that our conversation had led to something meaningful beyond just a good story for my portfolio. And I thought about her final question from that evening in the hotel lounge, the question that had been hovering over our entire conversation. Can success truly be called success if it costs the people closest to us? Lenora's answer, earned through 81 years of living and decades of hard reflection, was clear: no. Success without relationships is just expensive loneliness. Achievement without connection is accomplishment in service of emptiness. Wealth without family is comfort in profound isolation. She'd spent 45 years building an empire and lost a family in the process. She'd achieved everything ambition promised and discovered it wasn't enough. She'd proven she could succeed and learned that success wasn't the same as fulfillment. She'd gotten rich and ended up alone. And now, in her 80s, she was spending her remaining years trying to help others avoid her mistakes, using her wealth to support programs that would help families stay connected, sharing her cautionary tale with anyone willing to listen to uncomfortable truths about the cost of unchecked ambition. It was both heartbreaking and admirable, the wealthy woman who couldn't buy back what she'd lost but could perhaps prevent others from losing what they had. The successful businesswoman whose greatest achievement might ultimately be helping others prioritize differently than she had. I think about Lenora whenever I'm tempted to prioritize work over relationships, whenever achievement feels more urgent than presence, whenever I find myself constructing justifications for choices I know I'll regret. I think about her sitting alone in that hotel lounge, wealthy and refined and profoundly lonely, the living embodiment of success without balance. And I think about her warning, delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd lived both sides of the equation: you can't get back missed childhoods. You can't rebuild relationships from scratch when everyone's already built their lives around your absence. The choices you make in your 20s, 30s, and 40s about how you balance ambition and connection, those choices determine what your 80s will look like. Lenora's 80s looked like elegant, expensive solitude. And she was spending those years trying to help others write different endings to their stories. What did this story mean to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the 11th Hour Tales for more eye-opening tales every day.